10 years ago, Jeffrey Williams was dismissed as a failure by his teachers, who mocked his every mistake. Years later, he returned to the university as a respected professor. One of his harshest critics tried to apologize, but Jeffrey's response surprised everyone. Jeffrey Williams, a 15-year-old black teenager, faced constant discrimination at his prestigious suburban school. Black students were often labeled as troublemakers, and his impoverished background amplified the teacher's bias. Without expensive textbooks, new laptops, or private tutors, he attended in a worn but neatly mended uniform with a fraying backpack he'd used for 3 years. One of his toughest teachers was Mr. Hudson, a strict silver-haired math teacher known for his harsh standards. Jeffrey gave his best, but Mr. Hudson seemed to relish pointing out his errors. "You can't even solve basic problems," he'd declare in front of the class, with disdain. Other students snickered, and this harshness influenced other teachers. Jeffrey's essays were marked for a weak vocabulary, and his history responses were dismissed as not in-depth enough. Even his initiative went unacknowledged. Classmates mocked Jeffrey's efforts, calling out, "Hey, Jeffrey, another F," in the cafeteria. Why bother? You'll never amount to anything. Every day became a struggle for recognition, a battle he seemed doomed to lose. Yet he kept studying. After classes, he'd work late with textbooks, eyes tired, trying to master the material on his own. His only support was his mother, Miss Williams, a nurse who came home late but always encouraged him. "Don't let them break you," she'd say, holding his hand when he was down. "You're smart, you're strong, you have a future. Keep going." Her words gave him the strength to face each new day. Exam season arrived, bringing stress and late-night study sessions. Despite his hard work, his results barely passed. Teachers mocked, especially Mr. Hudson. "At least you didn't fail completely, but don't expect much in life with grades like that." For many, his scores were a disappointment. But for Jeffrey, they were proof he could persevere. Alone but supported by his mother, she hugged him tightly, whispering, "I'm proud of you, my boy. This is just the beginning." A few years after high school, Jeffrey Williams managed to get into the local college, despite his less than stellar grades. It wasn't prestigious, but it was his chance to prove himself. Passing the entrance exams was his first small victory, boosting his confidence. Determined not to repeat his high school mistakes, Jeffrey sat in the front row, asked questions, and attended every seminar. His dedication caught the eye of Professor Brown, a patient biology teacher who recognized his potential. Noticing Jeffrey's detailed notes and thoughtful questions, Professor Brown invited him to join a research project. "Your high school grades don't define you," he said. "I see how hard you work. This project will highlight your talent." For the first time, someone saw Jeffrey as more than just an average student. He eagerly joined the research on climate change's effects on local ecosystems. Jeffrey conducted experiments, gathered field data, and began to feel like a real scientist. With Professor Brown's guidance, Jeffrey started presenting at student conferences. Though his first presentation was nerve-wracking, he gained confidence as he spoke. Each presentation honed his skills, and soon he earned a reputation as a talented young researcher. His work appeared in scientific journals, catching the attention of larger research institutions. In one article, he pointed out flaws in environmental monitoring systems, which drew significant attention. 2 years later, his achievements reached the university that had once rejected him. Impressed by his published research, they offered him a scholarship for a master's degree. The official invitation included the same school that had doubted him. His mother was overwhelmed with emotion when he showed her the letter. "You did it," she said, tears in her eyes. "You proved them wrong." For Jeffrey, this marked a new chapter. He hadn't just graduated college. He became a respected young scientist, recognized even by a university that once labeled him a lost cause. Now, he knew that school grades are only a phase and don't define one's future. With growing confidence and the support of mentors, he decided to pursue graduate school, ready for new scientific challenges and opportunities. 10 years later, Jeffrey Williams returned to the university where he once faced humiliation. Now, he was an invited professor, his scientific achievements recognized internationally. His research on climate's impact on ecosystems brought him several awards, and his name became a symbol of inspiration for students who faced prejudice. The university's invitation to lecture was a chance to prove how far he'd come. The lecture would take place in the same hall where he had once been shamed for his low grades. Among the audience would be some of the teachers who had deemed him a failure, including Mr. Hudson, his harshest critic. On the day of the lecture, the auditorium was packed. Students, faculty, and scholars filled the room, eager to hear him speak. A hush settled as Jeffrey walked in, tall, composed, in a sharp suit. Familiar faces stared back, including former teachers now filled with surprise. Jeffrey started his lecture with a smile. He discussed his research, the obstacles he overcame, and the importance of perseverance. Blending scientific facts with personal anecdotes, he said, "As a teenager, many thought I wouldn't achieve anything. My school grades were poor, and I was constantly told my potential was limited." He paused, scanning the attentive crowd. "But I learned that grades are just a small part of life. They don't define our worth or our future. What matters is the determination to keep learning, no matter others' opinions. If you don't give up, you'll find success." His words struck a chord, especially with those who remembered him as a struggling student. Jeffrey shared how his research had influenced environmental standards and his work with international organizations on global issues. His successes were a stark contrast to the challenges he'd faced in that very institution. When he mentioned his mother's unwavering belief in him, the room grew silent. "I stand here today because I refused to give up and found people who believed in me. Remember, it's not about what others think, but about your belief in yourself. Don't let others limit your potential." The audience responded with a standing ovation. Jeffrey spotted Mr. Hudson among the applause, acknowledging him in a way that signaled he had surpassed expectations. He no longer needed validation, but it symbolized his journey from failure to respected professor. After the lecture, students crowded around Jeffrey, seeking advice and sharing how inspired they felt. Jeffrey realized his journey was far from over. His true mission was now to support those facing similar bias. He had become a beacon of perseverance, inspiring future generations of students and young scientists. After the lecture, the audience slowly dispersed. Students, full of impressions and inspiration, left, discussing Jeffrey Williams' memorable and impactful speech. Among them was Mr. Hudson, who remained in the shadows, observing. His face reflected a mix of surprise and hesitation. The stern, judgmental look he once had was now thoughtful, and perhaps even remorseful. As students began to leave the hall, he made the decision to approach Jeffrey. Jeffrey was standing by the podium, answering questions from a few curious students, when Mr. Hudson cautiously came closer. He stopped a short distance away, waiting until the students left, then cleared his throat nervously. Jeffrey turned and froze for a moment, seeing the person who had once symbolized humiliation and injustice. "Jeffrey," Mr. Hudson began, his voice strained with visible tension. "May I speak to you privately?" He looked older than Jeffrey remembered, with slumped shoulders and a tired gaze. It seemed he was battling the same memories that had weighed on Jeffrey for years. Jeffrey paused, studying the man who had once been his harshest critic. He saw not the stern, unyielding teacher, but an old man who perhaps wanted to make amends. But Jeffrey knew that some wounds had already healed, and Mr. Hudson's apology would not change what had happened in the past. "Mr. Hudson," Jeffrey said calmly but firmly, keeping a respectful tone, "I appreciate your interest, but I believe our conversation ended many years ago. I no longer need your apology or approval. What happened in the past no longer matters." Jeffrey's words were free of anger or malice. He felt he had outgrown the pain caused by the taunts and insults. It wasn't revenge, but a statement that he no longer depended on the opinion of those who once doubted his abilities. Mr. Hudson looked stunned. His hands trembled, and he tried to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. Seeing the successful scientist in front of him, a man he once deemed incapable of more, he realized he had been wrong. His attempt to apologize and acknowledge his mistakes was met with indifference that spoke louder than any words. Jeffrey no longer needed his validation. He had forged his destiny on his own. "I wish you well, Mr. Hudson," Jeffrey added, nodding gently, "and thank you for the lesson I learned from you." Then he turned and walked toward the waiting students, ready to discuss his research and answer their questions. For Jeffrey, this was a moment of true triumph. He had achieved far more than he ever imagined, despite all the obstacles. Now, not only did he teach at this university, but he also conducted research, held seminars, and supported students who, like him, fought for their place in the world. He had become the mentor he had long sought during his school years, and his office was always open to those in need of help or guidance. His success became a symbol of victory over systemic injustice. He knew his story inspired students who often felt underestimated or faced prejudice. Jeffrey made it his mission to support those in need, believing that his work would help change the academic environment, making it more inclusive and fair. Now his name was associated not with low grades, but with scientific discoveries and an unbreakable will to succeed. He became an example of how a person can overcome any obstacle if they believe in themselves and have support, even when it's barely there at the beginning.